On April 1st, Indian Air Force pilot Rajesh Ricky Sharma became the first and so far only Indian citizen in space when he launched aboard Soyuz mission T-11 to spend a week aboard the Salyut 7 space station. On the same day, soul singer Marvin Gaye intervened in a quarrel between his parents and was shot dead by his father. Gaye was regarded as one of the most influential musicians in the US, particularly in Motown, and tributes were paid across the world. A couple of days later, the death at 91 was announced of Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, wartime commander of the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command. His strategy of carpet-bombing German cities remains controversial. At the time of his death, he was widely praised by the wartime generation, and particularly the aircrews who had served under him, but he has often been described as a war criminal. The ongoing Iran-Iraq war saw the Iraqi Air Force make the first use of French Exocet missiles launched from their new Super Étendard fighters, both used by Argentina in the Falklands, to sink ships in the Persian Gulf suspected of carrying fuel to Iran. 2 Greek-registered ships were attacked, one of which sank. Meanwhile, on land, the large-scale use of chemical weapons, primarily mustard gas, had caused thousands of Iranian casualties, both civilian and military, and caused President Reagan to call this week for a global ban on such weapons. And as the Grand Prix circus prepared to return to Kyalami, the controversy over racing in apartheid South Africa was renewed as a car bomb in the coastal city of Durban killed 6. The African National Congress denied responsibility, though the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2001 would later establish that an ANC commander had been the culprit. But there was no question about the race going ahead, and just 6 months after the teams were last at the circuit. As usual, the high altitude and long straights would benefit the cars with the most power, but with almost everyone now running turbo engines, only Tyrrell and Arrows still without, it was a more level playing field than it had been for some years. Williams had spent the intervening weeks trying to fix the problems on the FW09. It seemed that the new rear-end suspension developed over the winter was so effective that the front end didn't grip as hard, and the result was severe understeer. Lafitte was generally happier with a bit of understeer, but Rosberg freely admits to hating it, preferring an oversteering car where he can flick the back end round corners. The team had put new differentials on which helped, but Rosberg still wasn't entirely happy with it. Over at Lotus, the team was still optimistic and tried out new Garrett turbochargers on Mansell's car, with De Angelis on the old KKK units, but only until Mansell was evidently much quicker and Elio insisted on and got Garrett's for his car too. Tyrrell were trying a variation on the old water-cooled brakes wheeze. Their engine, like many, used a water injection system to cool the cylinders, a perfectly normal and legal component, but the weight of the water was calculated into the car's weight, allowing them to run underweight as it was used through the race and then topped off at a late pit stop before the end. There were problems at Ferrari as Arnaud and Alboreto both struggled to get their car set up. They just weren't getting downforce coming out of the tight corners, but adding more wing just slowed them down on the straights, while taking wing off made the car slither around so much they blistered their tyres. Qualifying saw Nelson Piquet, happier with his car than in Brazil, absolutely demolish Patrick Tambay's 1983 pole time, set, remember, just 6 months ago, by nearly 2 seconds. Alongside him was Rosberg, who had a funny way of showing he didn't like his car. Mansell was third, with Tambay alongside in the Renault, Prost and Farby on row 3, with De Angelis an unhappy 7th and Lauda 8th. Warwick and a despondent Alboreto made up the top 10, with Lafitte 11th, Senna an impressive 13th, 2 places ahead of Arnaud, and perhaps inevitably, the 4 non-turbo cars were the 4 at the back, with Boutsen the unlucky non-qualifier. However, during the Saturday morning warm-up, Ghinzani had a nasty off, swapping ends at the Yuxkai sweep and completely demolishing his car. The Azella caught fire, and the team's hearts must have stopped as they saw Piercarlo, in shock, start calmly removing his helmet and gloves as several other drivers stopped to help. Fortunately, the fire marshals were on the spot and quickly doused the flames, including spraying Ghinzani directly in the face as his overalls were on fire. The Italian was taken to the hospital, miraculously with nothing more serious than a few burns to his hands and neck. But with Ghinzani in obviously no shape to race, Boutsen was bumped up to the grid and the teams got ready to go. As they were about to set off on the parade lap, Prost's car just wouldn't start, so it was pushed off and he vaulted the pit wall and hopped in the spare, which was set up for Lauda. A mistaken marshal waved him onto the circuit, but he was signalled back in at the end of the parade lap because he was supposed to be starting from the pit lane, and the start had to be aborted and a new one called with a 15-minute break while everything was sorted out. Finally, they were ready to go, and the lights went red, then green, and Piquet almost stalled, getting away slowly as he had in Brazil, as Rosberg charged into the lead. Unlike in Brazil though, Piquet managed to sort himself out quickly enough to put his foot down and retake second place before the first corner, while Fabi had also had a great start to slot in third ahead of Lauda. Then the two Renaults and De Angelis, whose teammate Mansell had suffered a momentary loss of power and dropped back into midfield. Before the end of the lap, Piquet was right behind Rosberg and was passed going up Leo Kopp as they completed lap 1. On lap 2, Fabi was passed at the same place, and the two Brabhams quickly disappeared over the horizon while Lauda got past the Williams on lap 4 and set off in pursuit, catching up to Fabi quickly enough. The Renaults were now queued up behind Rosberg, Warwick leading Tombe and apparently unable to make much impression on the Finn, so Keke was leading the pair, with De Angelis and Alboreto behind, while the Brabhams and Lauda got ever further ahead. Prost, meanwhile, had made his way back up to 16th and was still charging. Lauda pulled out to take Fabi on lap 10 and used all of his experience to stave off the younger man's counter-attack on the downhill slope, and Fabi pulled in for new Michelins on the following lap, emerging 13th, just ahead of Senna, who'd lost a chunk of his Tollman's nose in a midfield fracas earlier on. With Rosberg still holding up everyone else, Lauda charged up to the back of Piquet, catching him as the pair lapped Parma's Ram. The Austrian was putting pressure on Piquet, but the champion was a tougher nut to crack than the relatively inexperienced Fabi, and the pair ran in formation for lap after lap as they made their way through the backmarkers. Teo Fabi was back into the pits 7 laps after his stop with a blown turbo, while Piquet also seemed to be increasingly struggling to keep Lauda behind him, peeling in to replace blistered tyres on lap 21. The usually slick Brabham pitwork was a trifle tardy on this occasion, keeping Piquet stationary for 9 seconds, 3 longer than Fabi, and he returned to the track 6th. His mirrors were now full of the other McLaren, Prost having tigered his way up to 7th. With fresh rubber, Piquet made short work of De Angelis and Tombe, taking both on his outlap, nearly tripped over Baldi's Spirit, then disposed of Warwick and Rosberg with almost contemptuous ease. Behind him, Prost had got past De Angelis and Tombe and was also pursuing the Rosberg-Warwick pairing, while the Lotus driver also passed Tombe and was still on Prost's rear wing. Piquet's heroic comeback drive ended on lap 30 as his turbo gave way, by which time Lauda was already a full minute ahead of Rosberg and pulling away all the time. With the leader apparently in no danger of being caught, attention turned back to the Rosberg train, where the 1982 champion now led Prost, Warwick and De Angelis, with Tombe just behind. On lap 31, Prost peeled in for new tyres as the race approached half-distance, but a sticking left rear wheel nut held him up, and he emerged at the same time as Warwick, now in 10th and 11th places, just ahead of Lauda, who was approaching to lap them both. Such was Lauda's lead that he made his own tyre stop in a leisurely 10 seconds, and returned to the track still some 10 seconds ahead of the Williams. Next in was Rosberg, who nearly stalled on the getaway, dropping in behind Lafitte and Alboreto, both running on harder tyres and planning to go non-stop, and now up to 4th and 5th respectively. De Angelis came in for a tyre stop, went out, came back in again with something wrong with his throttle linkage. The engine cover was taken off and the team got to work. Elio was eventually sent out again, but his race was effectively over. By now, Prost had made his way back up through the field and overtook Lafitte for second place on lap 39. Not bad going from a pit lane start. By lap 50, with most of the major players having either stopped or not planning to, the race had settled down into something of a parade, with Lauda lapping metronomically at the front, and the fight over 4th place between Alboreto and Warwick being the best viewing on the circuit, until Derek put in a typically brave move at Crowthorne to take the place. Mansell's turbo failed on lap 52, putting him out from a typically gutsy drive that had got him back into the points after his early setback, while Rosberg went out with a broken driveshaft joint. Warwick had blistered his tyres fighting Alboreto and had to come in for a third set, which meant he had to do it all again, rejoining 7th behind De Angelis. To his credit, he did, getting his head down and charging anew, disposing quickly of the Lotus, and with teammate Tombe next on his list. Jacques Lafitte had been running a solid if unspectacular race, but lost what looked like assured third place when his right rear wheel parted company with the suspension, fortunately with as little drama as the rest of his race. Tombe had already got past Alboreto, so went up into third, and the Italian now had Warwick right on his gearbox once more, looking for a way past, and finding it just as the yellow flag started waving for Stefan Beloff, who'd gone straight on at Crowthorne and fairly buried his Tyrrell in the new sand trap, which had replaced the tyre wall at the high-speed turn for this year. There were now just 9 laps to go, and Lauda led Prost by some 40 seconds, with Tombe and Warwick 3rd and 4th, then Alboreto and Patrese, with De Cesaris up to 7th after a quiet race so far. Everyone moved up a place when Tombe once again spluttered to a halt out of fuel, a recurrence of the glitch in the fuel management software that had put paid to his race in Brazil. The normally cheerful Frenchman could do nothing but stand with his hands on his hips, looking in despair at his car as it was wheeled away. Ironically, he'd put up the fastest lap of the race 1 lap earlier. 4 laps later, Alboreto also ran dry, pulling off and climbing out looking just as hacked off as Tombe, his predecessor in the number 27 Ferrari, as both drivers still awaited their first finish for their new team. If Lauda was worried about his fuel consumption, he didn't show it, continuing to build his lead over Prost to over a minute even when Winkelhock's BMW engine let go directly in front of him. Manfred had already been some 15 laps behind after frequent pit visits to fix a niggling problem, so this just put the tin hat on another bad weekend for ATS. So Niki Lauda took his 20th career win, his first since 1982 and his first in a turbocharged car, in emphatic style with a huge gap of 1 minute 6 seconds over Prost in second place. Derek Warwick took a well-deserved third place, his first career podium place, with Patrese and De Cesaris taking their first points for their new teams in 4th and 5th, and Ayrton Senna taking his first career point in 6th. The young Brazilian was so exhausted from wrestling with his damaged car that he had to be lifted out of the cockpit and sent for medical attention. De Angelis, Baldi, Sierra, Eno, Brundle and Boutsen were the only other cars still running at the end, though Alboreto had at least been far enough ahead to be classified 12th ahead of the Belgian. Alain Prost thus retained the championship lead, while 2 wins from 2 for McLaren put them in a huge lead already in the Constructors' Championship. Their dominance in South Africa had a lot of the other teams worried, particularly as they were once again said to have had plenty of fuel left in the tank at the end. BMW, meanwhile, had had 3 engine or turbo failures out of 3 today and would have a lot of work to do to challenge the McLarens.